Hi, I'm Paul. For this video, I want to talk about the soul, my interpretation of what the soul is, how it appears, how possibly you can find it, what the soul means. And to describe this, I'm going to talk about the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. So firstly, the left hemisphere of the brain likes to be controlling, likes to write its own stories and describe everything in its own way, likes to be controlling, doesn't really see reality for what it is because it's always trying to find its own description to make it its own. Always trying to fragment everything, making everything separate. It also only has two emotions as well: anger and disgust. So I met somebody a little while ago who was trying to find enlightenment, trying to seek reality, seek himself. Only every time I met him, he always talked about conspiracy theories, how we've been lied to, how the government have lied to us, how disgusted he is about the way the world is, and always made himself very angry. And the point I'm trying to make here is his expression of anger and disgust made it obvious that he was working from a left hemisphere. So I described this to him. So he said, well, how do I start using the right hemisphere? Well, unfortunately, you can't just say, well, stop using the left and stop using the right. It just doesn't work like that. So I came up with a metaphor. And I said, the Garden of Eden is hidden behind a door in the back of a closet. Only to get to that door, you have to face the demons you've kept locked away in the closet. You have to turn inwards. See, the left hemisphere I would kind of describe as being the narcissistic hemisphere, being very controlling. So when I say the Garden of Eden is hidden behind a door in the back of a closet, see, the Garden of Eden is heaven. It's this, just as it is, without having to write stories over this like the left hemisphere wants to do. Hell is seeking. Adam and Eve was kicked out of the Garden of Eden seeking knowledge. That's from the left hemisphere. So describing this to the person that you have to turn inwards and face your demons, which you've had hidden away in the closet, this means you've got to turn inwards and face your fears, your anxieties, your insecurities. So the left and the right hemisphere is connected together at the bottom of the brain by, I think it's called the corpus callosum, if I've said that right. But in this day and age, it seems that more and more of us are more getting trapped in the left hemisphere because of advertisements, news, fears, anxieties, worries, mobile phones, just continuous distractions. Now, like I say, the left hemisphere seems to be more narcissistic, being more controlling, trying to rewrite what reality is. I studied narcissism for a long time, and when I just came to the end of my studies on it, my answer to it was, narcissists don't have a soul. And of course, this is on a spectrum. So from people who entirely live in the control and behavior of the left hemisphere, to maybe people not so much controlling. I spoke to somebody once who was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and he described to me that he had to remind himself when to blink. It's like it didn't come naturally, he had to control the blinking. So to me, this seems like it's pretty much the entire left hemisphere controlling everything. So if we look at how the right hemisphere works in conjunction with the left hemisphere, if you think back to maybe when you was learning to drive or learning to ride a bicycle, when you first had to learn, you had to talk yourself through it, tell yourself when to change gear, when to indicate, had to constantly think of what's coming next. And this is quite tiring, because you had to think constantly. Well, I think this is what the left hemisphere does, tries to talk everything through. Only when you start getting used to driving or riding a bicycle, it seems to come natural. It's like you don't have to talk yourself through it anymore. And I think this is where the right hemisphere comes in. It starts to feel the way through itself, flowing naturally. And I think with people who live in the left hemisphere, you have to have this continuous control, talking the way through life. It's as if the right hemisphere doesn't come in and take over naturally and let things flow. I suppose this is where the flow state comes. So the flow state is when you've not got the left hemisphere trying to talk your way through it, where it just comes naturally and flows, which is from the right hemisphere. You see, the right hemisphere sees the world entirely different to the left. It basically feels the world, much more open to other options and possibilities, much more interested of what possibly could be. I find that a lot of people who have been seeking for enlightenment, seeking spirituality, tend to be the people who have been suffering. And people who have been suffering and trying to find enlightenment, spirituality, start to turn within, start facing their own demons to find the Garden of Eden. I think the Garden of Eden is the right hemisphere. And when people have been seeking and finally reach this, start to see the world differently through the right hemisphere rather than the left hemisphere being controlling, I think that this is where the appearance of a soul comes from. So what I'm kind of saying is the soul, I think, is the right hemisphere. It's something physical, belongs to the brain. I don't think it's spiritual. But I'm not trying to destroy the idea that we all have a spiritual side, which when we pass away, that our spiritual carries on. I think that's something different. I think that is consciousness, which I think is separate to the soul. You see, when I describe consciousness, I'm describing the universal consciousness. I'm not fully understanding of this quite yet, but if I was to take a best guess, I would say that consciousness, the universal consciousness, is the energy. So when we're not looking from the left hemisphere, we start to realize that nothing is separate. Everything is one. Just one big energy. And I think that one big energy is the consciousness. And what comes out of the consciousness is the idea of a self, the idea of separation. And I think that's where the left hemisphere tries to write over reality, trying to create separation. So when I say about when we die and the reincarnation, I don't think it's got anything to do with the soul, but more to do with consciousness. You see, the consciousness is the energy, and the idea of a self comes out of the energy, essentially just an illusion of a self. So I still think that when you do pass away, this energy still continues and then creates a new illusion of a self. So when I say the soul is connected to the physical body as in the brain, and it's not a separate spirit or soul which continues, I do think that that would be consciousness that continues. I believe there was an experiment in the US, military experiment or something, government experiment, called the Gateway Experiment. I think the experiment they also called hemisphere synchronization. And in the experiment, they tested people in the sleep, in deep sleep, REM, I think they said it was. And they had asked questions of things of the future, things that the person who's asleep shouldn't know, but in the dream state, they seem to know things that they shouldn't know, suggesting spiritual. And the way that this worked was when you're deep in sleep, the ego isn't active, which means the left hemisphere isn't controlling reality. And if the left hemisphere isn't in control and the right hemisphere comes in, you start to see reality more for what it is. You start to see that everything's connected. So it seems that we're much more clearer and understanding of reality when the ego, the left hemisphere, isn't controlling it. So in the experiments, what we did was put people, well, not put people to sleep, but when people got to such a deep sleep of REM, we had asked them questions and set up things like they'd have an envelope with something in it, and they'd wake up a person when they're in a deep sleep and ask him what they think's in the envelope, and it was quite surprising how many people actually knew. Did other experiments of what's going to happen tomorrow and woke them up in the deep sleep, and they seemed to know. But it's quite interesting how they did the experiment on the synchronization of a right and left brain when we was both working in conjunction with each other. We seem to see things that we shouldn't know. But in a sense, why shouldn't you know? When reality itself is only one big energy, and there's no separation. When the left hemisphere is silenced, and the right hemisphere takes over, you start to see that everything's one. It's one energy, so why wouldn't you know these things? Anyway, thanks very much for listening.